Okay, we're going to back out a little bit now from the microscopic level to the macroscopic. I'm going to talk about muscles and how they get their energy. Muscle cells only have a little bit of ATP in storage. They use such a massive amount of ATP, not only for excitation, contraction, coupling, along with the cross-bridge cycle and detaching the myosin heads, but simply pumping all the ions where they need to go also. Remember, all the calcium ions need to be pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The sodium potassium pump has never stopped, and all of that just takes a tremendous amount of ATP. Most of you have exercised for more than 5 seconds at a time, and so there has to be some kind of way to regenerate our ATP. We can do this in several different ways. We can do an immediate resupply of phosphorylation due to just transferring a phosphate. We can also use glycolysis, which is very, very fast, but also horribly inefficient. And then the best way is long-term, and it's called aerobic cellular respiration. So with the immediate supply of ATP phosphate, what we're going to do is basically take something called creatine phosphase, and we're going to transfer the phosphase off the creatine onto adenosine diphosphate, giving us adenosine triphosphate. So you can see this over here on the right. Here's our diphosphate. Here's our creatine. Well, up here would be our creatine phosphate. And they get together along with an enzyme called creatine kinase, giving us ATP and just regular creatine without the phosphate on it because it got transferred over to the adenosine diphosphate. We can also do the same thing with something called myokinase, which is going to take 2 adenosine diphosphates and take the phosphate off one of them and stick it onto the other, giving us an adenosine triphosphate and an adenosine monophosphate. This is incredibly fast. It's pretty much instant. If we're looking at, rechargeable battery, this isn't recharging the battery. This is simply swapping the battery out for a brand new one. Short term, we can also use glycolysis to generate ATP. Now, this does not require oxygen. We're going to take glucose and split it into pyruvate, and this occurs in the cytosol of the muscles. But long term, we're going to have to do aerobic respiration, and that's going to require oxygen. It's going to utilize the mitochondria within the cell. We're going to take that pyruvate that we did in glycolysis, and we're going to run it through the Krebs cycle, and we're going to get anywhere from 28 to 32 ATP, depending on which enzymes are used in the system. I'm not going to make you memorize all the processes here. Just know that we've got our 3 basic systems, which is creatine phosphate, which is instant, glycolysis, which is really, really fast but inefficient, and then aerobic respiration, which is really efficient, but it also takes a lot longer to get going. So for instance, let's say you're sprinting for less than 10 seconds. All the ATP of your muscles can be supplied via the ATP currently in them. That's your first 5 seconds or so. And the next 5 seconds can be supplied through creatine phosphate. If you're going to sprint for, 30 seconds or so, then of course the first 5 seconds would be the ATP stored within the muscle. The second 5 would be the ATP regenerated from creatine phosphase. And then the next 20 to 30 seconds are going to be via glycolysis. But after that, glycolysis starts to build up with waste products, the pyruvate, and you've got nowhere to put it, and it starts to clog up the processes of the cell, and the muscle is going to shut down. This is why humans need to keep breathing. We can't do anaerobic respiration for normal energy conversion. It's like I said, it's really, really inefficient. So if you're running more than 30 to 40 seconds, say you're doing a marathon or something, then that first little bit can be supplied by the systems we've already talked about, but then after that, it's going to require quite a lot of breathing. So again, the first 5 to 6 seconds you can do with the ATP stored within the muscle cells. And of course, it's not an either or thing. You're going to be using that ATP and regenerating very quickly via phosphorylation from the creatine phosphate. And then if you need to go a little bit longer, I know the book here says 60 seconds, but I've also seen figures making it down closer to 30 or so. That's going to be glycolysis. And then if it's going to be longer than a minute, then it's going to be aerobic respiration. Excuse me. If your muscles are working so hard that you can't quite supply enough oxygen to them, we start running into something called an oxygen debt. And after you exercise, you need to replace this oxygen. We need to replace oxygen on hemoglobin and another molecule called myoglobin. We need to reset our glycogen. We need to re-energize the creatine phosphate so that we could use it again if we need to. And then the lactic acid that we've created through glycolysis needs to be converted back to glucose. Now, when we look at muscle fibers, we organize them by a couple different ways. One is what kind of contraction they're generating, and two is what kind of energy system they're using primarily for ATP. And of course, if a muscle cell is leaning more toward glycolysis, then it's going to have a lot more of the enzymes required for glycolysis and less of the enzymes needed for aerobic respiration. And if a cell is more into aerobic respiration, then the opposite would be true. So when we look at different types of fibers, we typically categorize them as fast twitch fibers or slow twitch fibers. So fast twitch, and they're pretty much delineated by how quickly they twitch, which would be why the name is there, but also the speed at which they twitch and the duration. Larger fibers are always going to be more powerful, and in general, the fast twitch fibers are more powerful and quicker than the slow twitch fibers, but they're also going to fatigue much, much faster. So if you had to guess which energy system the fast twitch fibers would use, it would be, glycolysis. The slow twitch fibers, on the other hand, are much more into aerobic respiration. So we generally classify the fibers as being more oxidative or more glycolytic, and then there's kind of a middle ground. So the oxidative fibers are fatigue resistant. Remember, they're slower to contract. They don't generate quite as much power. They're using aerobic respiration, so they're going to have a lot of mitochondria. And they're also going to store a lot of oxygen in the form of a molecule called myoglobin. Myoglobin is related to hemoglobin. It's very similar. And because it's also a pigment, it's going to be kind of red. And this causes the muscle fibers to appear reddish. The glycolytic fibers, on the other hand, are going to use more glycolysis. So they're going to have a lot less myoglobin and a lot more of the enzymes that are conducive to glycolysis. Fewer mitochondria, fewer capillaries, because they don't require all that oxygen because they're not using it. And so they tend to be a paler color. So we call these white fibers. So we've got our slow oxidative fibers. These are going to be not quite, but almost purely aerobic respiration. And as I said, they're going to be red due to the myoglobin. These are our slow twitch fibers. And then we have our fast glycolytic fibers. The contractions are fast, they're powerful, but the muscles fatigue really, really quickly. And they're going to be very pale due to the lack of myoglobin. But we also have that middle ground I mentioned, which is the fast oxidative fibers. And this is kind of a intermediary between the slow oxidative and the fast glycolytic. So they're more of a light red or a pale red. When we look at an overall muscle, it's going to have a mixture of all of these fiber types. Depending on what kind of contractions the muscle usually does, we're going to have a higher percentage of one type of fiber than another. So for example, hand muscles have a really high percentage of our fast glycolytic white fibers, and that allows them to contract powerfully and very quickly, but they also fatigue relatively quickly. Your back muscles, on the other hand, have a high percentage of the slow oxidative fibers, and that allows them to sustain a contraction for hours and hours and hours. So as I said, a muscle is going to have a mixture. And this nifty picture on the right has a nice cross section. You can see our dark red slow oxidative fibers. There we go. And then we've got our fast glycolytics, which are very, very pale. And then we have the fast oxidatives, which are the rosé, the red, white, rosé. So if a long distance runner, if we looked at their muscle, the muscles of their legs, we're going to see a higher proportion of those slow oxidative fibers. They run for hours and hours. It's not extremely fast, but they can do it for a long time. And so those fibers are going to be storing more myoglobin and using that oxidative pathway to regenerate the ATP needed for contractions. Sprinters, on the other hand, are going to have a higher percentage of the fast glycolytic fibers. So it's determined partially by genetics and also a little bit by training. You can kind of convert 1 degree or so. So for instance, you can take those fast glycolytic fibers and convert them to the fast oxidative, or you can take the slow oxidative and convert them to fast oxidative, but that's about it. So if you take one of nature's greatest sprinters, Usain Bolt, and looked at his muscles, we're going to find a lot of the fast glycolytic fibers, a much higher proportion than we would in somebody who's a world-class marathon runner. Now, if Mr. Bolt decided to take up marathon running, he could convert some of his fast glycolytic fibers into our fast oxidative, but he's never going to be very good as a marathon runner. His genetics and his muscle, the way they're made, just aren't going to lend themselves to that kind of exercise.